Welcome back to Strategic Affairs. I'm Dr. Naim Tahir Baig, and this is part 3 of our series on the Poland-Ukraine analogy. We've covered how the comparison gets used and how Poland actually fell in 1939. Today we bring in a country almost nobody mentions in this conversation, and it might matter more than Poland does. Same year as Poland, same total lack of a great power alliance guarantee. Arguably worse, actually, since this country didn't even have Poland's paper promise. Invaded by one of the same two powers that crushed Poland, and it didn't fall. This is Finland, in the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, and it might be the single most useful comparison for understanding Ukraine that almost nobody brings up. Let's talk about why, and then let's look at the actual data on how people have been using this Munich comparison for the past decade. Finland had tried in the 1920s to build a regional defense pact with Estonia, Latvia, and Poland. It never got ratified. It had a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union signed in 1932. That didn't stop the invasion either. When the Soviets attacked, Finland appealed to Sweden, France, and Britain for actual combat troops. The League of Nations formally expelled the USSR as an aggressor, a moral condemnation with zero material teeth. What Finland actually got was limited volunteer support, mostly from Sweden. In hard structural terms, Finland fought a great power essentially alone. And here's where it gets interesting. Finnish forces put up genuinely skilled resistance, inflicting disproportionate losses on a much larger, better equipped Red Army. But by February 1940, Soviet forces broke through the Mannerheim Line. Unable to get the military support it needed, Finland signed the Moscow Peace Treaty in March 1940, ceding roughly 9 to 11% of its territory, including the city of Viipuri, and displacing about 400,000 people. That's a real painful loss. Nobody's calling this a Finnish victory. But Finland kept its government, its army, its constitution, its ability to run its own foreign policy, so much so that within about 15 months, it was independently negotiating a wartime arrangement with Germany to try to win that territory back. Compare that to Poland, partitioned, occupied, erased as a sovereign state, same year, same lack of a real alliance guarantee, completely different outcome. This is the payoff of bringing Finland into the conversation. If the weak guarantee equals collapse story were true, Finland should have collapsed too. It had an even weaker position than Poland. In alliance terms, it didn't, so something else was doing the real work. Two things stand out. First, number of fronts. Finland faced one aggressor from one direction. Poland faced two great powers invading from multiple directions simultaneously in secretly coordinated timing. Second, the aggressor's actual goal. Stalin's aims in Finland were bounded, pushing the border back from Leningrad, not eliminating the Finnish state. Historians point to Stalin's own behavior as evidence. He set up a puppet Finnish government early in the war, then quietly abandoned it once it became clear conquering Finland wouldn't be easy. Compare that to German and Soviet aims in Poland, which extended to full partition and, on the German side, a deliberate campaign to eliminate Polish administrative and political elites. There's an important caveat here too, and it's worth being honest about it. Finland's post-war independence came at a real cost. For decades, Finland practiced careful deference to Soviet preferences, staying out of NATO, softening criticism of Moscow, a pattern so distinctive it got its own name, Finlandization. Survival, in other words, isn't a clean binary between erased and totally free. It's a spectrum. Finland landed somewhere in the middle of it. That's actually a really useful frame for thinking about how Ukraine's war might eventually resolve. Not total victory versus total collapse, but somewhere on a spectrum, the way Finland was. Now let's put Ukraine through the same three questions: nuclear status, alliance design, and outcome. Alliance design, Ukraine's position isn't quite Poland's and it isn't quite Finland's either. In 1994, Ukraine gave up the Soviet nuclear weapons on its territory in exchange for the Budapest Memorandum, a security assurance from the US, UK, and Russia, deliberately drafted by American negotiators to be lighter than an actual mutual defense treaty. Then in 2008, NATO's Bucharest summit said Ukraine will become a member someday, without a membership action plan or timeline. So Ukraine's position is a third in-between category. Not Poland's bilateral guarantee, not Finland's total absence of any instrument, but a vaguer, Longer running promise with no clear mechanism attached. Outcome so far, Ukraine has fought a single front war against one aggressor, unlike Poland's two. It has kept its capital, its government, its ability to negotiate on its own behalf. It recovered significant territory in 2022, has since lost ground in the east, and as of mid-2026 the war remains genuinely unresolved. With Russia's territorial gains over the prior year measured at under 1% of Ukraine's 1991 territory, against enormous casualties on both sides. Reported estimates put combined killed and wounded at roughly 1 million for Russia and several 100,000 for Ukraine. On every one of these dimensions, Ukraine's trajectory looks a lot more like Finland's contested survival story than Poland's 5-week collapse. Here's the part I found most compelling. Rather than just asserting how the analogy gets used, this research actually built a dataset. 22 publicly documented invocations of the Poland-Munich comparison. From 2014 through early 2026, government officials, commentators, op-eds, Zelensky himself, each one checked against a primary source, and coded as either the narrow appeasement invites more aggression version, the sweeping these situations will play out identically version, or an explicit rejection of the comparison altogether. The breakdown: about 9 of the 22 use the big sweeping version, about 6 use the narrow careful version. About 7 explicitly argued the comparison doesn't hold up or reached for a different one entirely. 2 patterns stood out. Sitting government officials, including Zelensky's own verified remarks in 2022 and 2025, leaned toward the careful, narrow version far more than press coverage of their remarks suggested at the time. And the sweeping version showed up disproportionately in opinion and commentary pieces, not in the analysis written by people whose work most directly shapes military and policy decisions. In other words, the big dramatic version of this comparison is doing more work as a rhetorical device than as an actual predictive tool for the people closest to the war. So here's where the evidence lands. The narrow appeasement invites escalation version of the Munich comparison holds up reasonably well. The sweeping these two wars will unfold identically version does not. And Finland is the proof that alliance status alone was never the whole story, even in 1939. There's one more variable we haven't touched yet, and it's arguably the single biggest difference between 1939 and today: nuclear weapons. Next episode, we look at how that variable actually changed the war's shape, and we run a forward-looking test on the next country everyone's already comparing to Ukraine, Taiwan.